Hollywood actors Meagan and Jonathan Majors have now received Guinean citizenship after tracing their ancestry back to West Africa. But this story isn't only about passports, it's about identity, about timing, and about why this moment matters far more than it appears at first glance. Because when you look closely at the details surrounding how this happened, when it happened, and who was involved, a much bigger picture begins to form. And that picture raises one quiet but powerful question: why is this happening now? The ceremony itself was private. No massive press spectacle, no dramatic public announcements. Instead, the couple traveled to Conakry, Guinea's capital, where they were formally granted citizenship during a closed event with senior officials. One of the president's top representatives publicly described them as worthy sons and daughters of Guinea, emphasizing that they now represent the country on a global stage. On the surface, this seems like a beautiful cultural moment, and in many ways it is. But this isn't happening in isolation. Guinea is part of a growing movement across West Africa, where countries are offering citizenship to members of the African diaspora who can trace their ancestry back through historical displacement. Benin has done it, Ghana has done it, and now Guinea is doing it too. Which immediately raises a larger question: is this just symbolic, or is something more strategic taking shape across the region? Because when nations begin formalizing these connections, they aren't only offering emotional closure, they're creating political, cultural, and global visibility. And that matters. What makes this story even more complex is the timing around Jonathan Majors specifically. Just a few years ago, Majors was positioned as one of Hollywood's fastest rising stars. Major roles, critical acclaim, a future mapped out inside the Marvel universe. Then came public legal challenges that shifted the trajectory of his career almost overnight. It's important to be precise here. His case has been widely reported on, discussed publicly, and addressed within formal legal processes. Following his conviction on assault and harassment charges, Marvel Studios chose to move forward without him in future projects. These are public facts, not speculation. But here's where the story becomes more layered. Instead of disappearing from public life, instead of retreating from visibility, Majors and Good made a different move. They stepped toward heritage, toward identity, toward cultural belonging. And that choice changes how this entire moment is interpreted. Because this isn't just about two actors receiving citizenship, it's about two people redefining how they are seen on the global stage. Meagan Good's presence in this story is also significant. She stood by Majors throughout his legal process. She remained publicly supportive. Their relationship moved forward. They became engaged. And eventually they married quietly. That alone sparked discussion online. But when you combine that with this citizenship decision, the narrative becomes something else entirely. Not a scandal story. Not a comeback story. But a repositioning story. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Observers familiar with how public narratives evolve often point out that identity shifts are rarely accidental. When someone changes the lens through which the world sees them, from celebrity to cultural descendant, from individual to representative of a nation, that alters the conversation entirely. Suddenly, the context expands. Suddenly, the story is no longer just about Hollywood. It becomes about history, about legacy, about belonging. And there's another layer here that almost nobody is talking about yet, because Guinea's decision to grant citizenship didn't happen in a vacuum. The country itself is navigating a complex political moment. Its leadership, its global image, its future direction, all of that is under international attention. When public figures with global recognition become associated with a nation during such periods, that association carries weight on both sides. Which leads to a subtle but important question: who benefits from this moment, and how? Is this simply cultural reconnection? Is it symbolic diplomacy? Is it soft power in motion? Or is it something more personal than political? The truth is, it may be all of the above. And that's exactly why this story is more strategic, more layered, and more significant than a typical celebrity headline. Because when you trace the timeline carefully, when you compare when this citizenship was granted with what was happening publicly around their lives, you start to see patterns, and those patterns suggest intention, not randomness, not in a negative sense, but in a deliberate one. People don't usually make moves like this casually. They make them when they're redefining who they are. To understand why this moment resonates so strongly, you have to zoom out. Because Guinea is not the only country doing this. Over the past few years, several West African nations have begun formally inviting members of the African diaspora to reconnect, not only emotionally, but legally. Benin introduced citizenship pathways. Ghana naturalized hundreds of African Americans after publicly inviting descendants of enslaved people to come home. These are not isolated gestures. They are part of a broader cultural shift that is still unfolding. So when Guinea extended citizenship to Meagan and Jonathan Majors, it placed them inside a much larger historical movement, and that instantly changes the narrative. This is no longer a celebrity lifestyle story. It becomes a story about history reclaiming continuity. But here's the detail that many viewers overlook at first. The citizenship ceremony wasn't staged for headlines. It wasn't live-streamed. It wasn't promoted as spectacle. It happened quietly. And in storytelling, quiet decisions often carry more weight than loud ones. People who analyze public perception point out that when individuals make meaningful identity-based choices privately rather than performatively, it tends to signal something deeper, not branding but realignment. Which brings us back to Jonathan Majors' trajectory. After public controversy reshaped his Hollywood path, the expectation from many observers was predictable. Issue statements, attempt image repair, seek industry re-entry. But instead, what emerged was a different arc, less focused on public rehabilitation, more focused on internal grounding, not a PR-driven reinvention, but an identity-driven one. And that difference is subtle but critical. Because when someone anchors themselves in heritage, ancestry, and cultural belonging, they're no longer positioning themselves purely as a celebrity. They're positioning themselves as part of something older than fame itself. That reframing doesn't erase the past. It doesn't override accountability. But it does shift the lens through which the future is viewed. Meagan Good's role in this transition also adds depth. Her career has spanned decades. She has navigated Hollywood from a young age, experienced its volatility, its pressure, and its reinventions. She is not new to public scrutiny, which makes her consistent presence in this story feel less impulsive and more intentional. Together, their actions suggest something that's easy to miss in headline culture. They are not just reacting to events, are choosing direction. And when public figures choose direction instead of reacting to pressure, the long-term implications tend to be far more significant than any short-term controversy. But there's another dimension here that hasn't fully surfaced yet. Citizenship isn't only symbolic. It's legal. It's cultural. It's geopolitical. When someone becomes a citizen of another nation, it creates new affiliations, new obligations, and new perceptions, especially when those individuals carry global visibility. It also creates new conversations. Are they now cultural ambassadors? Will they engage with local initiatives? Will this lead to future projects connected to the region? Will this influence how other public figures approach their own ancestry? No one knows yet. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes this moment so significant. Because cultural shifts don't announce themselves loudly when they begin. They emerge quietly, through patterns, through choices, through moments like this. What started as a DNA test led to a ceremony, which led to citizenship, which has now led to a global conversation. And we may only be seeing the earlier stage. Consider this, moments like these often become reference points years later. Not because of the celebrity involved, but because of what they normalized. DNA-based heritage reconnection used to be niche. Now, it's mainstream. Dual citizenship for cultural restoration used to be rare. Now it's growing. Public figures grounding themselves in ancestry used to be framed as symbolic. Now it's increasingly seen as structural. That progression matters. And it leads to a question that quietly lingers beneath the entire story. Are we watching two individuals reconnect with history, or are we watching the early signs of a broader shift in how identity, nationality, and belonging are defined in the modern world? Because if more countries formalize these pathways, and if more public figures follow similar journeys, this stops being celebrity news. It becomes cultural evolution. What makes this moment so compelling isn't the ceremony, it isn't the headlines, it isn't even the celebrity, it's the direction. Because when public figures begin making decisions rooted in identity rather than optics, the impact extends beyond their own lives. It subtly reshapes the cultural conversation around belonging, heritage, and legacy. For Jonathan Majors, this moment arrives after a period that has clearly altered his public trajectory. His career, once positioned for long-term dominance in blockbuster franchises, has shifted into something far more uncertain. And yet, instead of watching a traditional comeback campaign, audiences are watching something quieter, a recentering around meaning rather than momentum. That contrast matters, not because it rewrites the past, not because it resolves public debate, but because it suggests that the next chapter of his life may not be built around approval, but around alignment. For Meagan, this development fits into a broader pattern. Her career has consistently reflected resilience, self-definition, and long-term perspective. Her participation in this moment doesn't read as spontaneous. It reads as deliberate. Together, their decision creates a narrative that is easy to misunderstand if viewed only through the lens of celebrity culture. This isn't about attention. It's about positioning. And positioning shapes futures. Cultural historians often point out that major shifts don't begin with institutions. They begin with individuals whose actions subtly redefine norms. Citizenship rooted in ancestry, identity rooted in lineage, belonging rooted in history. These ideas are becoming more normalized with each public example, not because they are trendy, but because they address something deeper, the human need for continuity. In a world where fame is temporary and reputations shift quickly, legacy becomes the more enduring currency. And legacy isn't built on headlines. It's built on decisions that carry weight beyond the moment. That's why this story lingers. Not because it tells us who these two people are, but because it forces a larger question into the open. What does it actually mean to belong somewhere? Is it birthplace? Is it culture? Is it ancestry? Is it legal recognition? Or is it the personal decision to step toward identity rather than away from it? Those questions don't have clean answers, but they are becoming increasingly central to how the world thinks about identity in the modern era. And this story sits directly inside that shift. What began as a DNA test led to a ceremony. That ceremony led to citizenship. That citizenship has now sparked conversation far beyond Guinea, far beyond Hollywood, and far beyond two individual careers. This isn't a closing chapter, it's an opening one, because the real impact of this decision won't be visible this week, or this month, or even this year. It will show up later, in who follows similar paths, in how governments expand these programs, and in how identity itself is discussed globally. If you want to understand where culture is heading next, you don't look at trends, you look at early signals, and this feels like one of them. If this story caught your attention, the next one goes even deeper, into how Hollywood, identity, and legacy are colliding more frequently than ever before, and why these moments are becoming more common, not less. Because some stories aren't about fame. They're about belonging, and those are the ones that tend to shape the future.